listening to The Donor Doctor Show, where your host, James Newberry, will help you improve the health of your fundraising. Now over to James.
Hello, this is The Donor Doctor again for our last show, and I have a special guest, a fan of The Donor Doctor Show, Mark Mehling. And Mark is a veteran of direct marketing, but just started getting into fundraising copywriting. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. I've been doing the commercial side for many, many years. And I certainly, not to pick on words, but I prefer direct response marketing because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. But yeah, I really enjoy your show, and I'm honored to be here for the last one.
Great. Now, of course, I had Richard Vigri on as my last guest, and you've met him at AWAI, is that correct?
AWAI, or the American Writers and Artists Association, has a boot camp, and Richard came down and spoke, and it's absolutely an amazing gentleman because you do feel like you're dealing with somebody who has lived the history. And so I had a great conversation with him, and it was very motivational and part of what led me to your podcast, James.
Well, that's great. Of course, there's another Richard I interviewed, Richard Armstrong, who was the Man of the Year, and you can go on YouTube and listen to his speech in front of AWAI.
And in fact, I was there for him and had an opportunity to have a couple nice conversations with him. Absolutely intriguing person to listen to. And one of the things that's really amazing is his ability to speak and give you the sense that it's off the cuff. But I can tell you, just like his copy, that Richard really works hard on it.
Well, I can imagine. Of course, you also met somebody I didn't mention, but who I'm a fan of too, is Dan Kennedy. And I particularly liked what he wrote about nostalgia. But he's had several good books. What's your favorite Dan Kennedy book?
Sorry, that's too much. I think I own every Dan Kennedy book.
Oh, so, I see. It's too much to choose. Like choosing between your children.
That's really what it is. And I have to tell you, it was a book that got me started with him. Over 10 years ago, I had a small business, and I was trying to find out what I was doing or not doing to make it grow better. And I picked up a book of his on marketing to the affluent. And that's what moved me into
I have that one. Yeah.
What's known as Planet Dan by us acolytes. And no, Dan is, I just think, absolutely an amazing copywriter, a business person, and even just a speaker. Fabulous.
Well, excellent. Now, you have a few questions for me. Is that correct?
Well, I've got tons of questions for you because most of the time you're bringing on all these experts, and yet I'm sure everybody who listens to this would like to know much more about you. So let me ask, what made you get into fundraising?
Well, I kind of fell into it. It's a skill that if you master, you can make money from. Probably the two best ways to get into fundraising, most people just don't go to work with a fundraising agency. It'd be to work for a nonprofit or to work for a political campaign. And the advantages of both those kind of organizations is you can do a lot of other stuff. You do a variety of things. You might help with events. You might, and I became the guy that could write fundraising letters, in addition to doing events and things like that. So it was a skill that I developed there. And once you have that skill, then you can work at a fundraising agency, which is an excellent way. Certainly, there's a lot of opportunity with freelancing, but it's nice to get a certain skill level before you do that, I think.
So you're kind of jumping ahead in my long list of questions, but you may have just answered one, and that is, for somebody just starting in the field, you think a fundraising agency might be the best way to get started?
Or working directly at a nonprofit. There's a lot of opportunities at a nonprofit, master all kinds of fundraising. So, I think you could do a variety of things.
What was your first campaign, James, that you were involved in?
Well, I worked, I worked for a dentist, He was a state rep, and the letter we wrote, the consultant kind of wrote this. It did a letter that wasn't appropriate to the market. He wrote this kind of very political, and most of the donors were other dentists because they wanted to protect their, have somebody to protect their interests or at least speak on their interests. So I changed it. I had a letter talking about issues that dentists cared about, and then I had a personal letter that he hand signed to his friends, who were giving because they're friends and family, not so much because of issues or party affiliation. So that was my first letter, and that was, I don't know, 86 or so. And then
that's all right. You don't need to date yourself. That's all right.
Yeah, no. And then I worked. From that, I got a job on Capitol Hill for Senator Phil Gramm. So he hadn't been a senator for a while. And then I went and worked at an agency, worked in campaigns, that kind of thing. So it all builds upon itself.
So you'd say your first big break was working for Phil Gramm?
Yeah, I guess that was it's a good. I enjoyed that job, and it was all. I started off as a legislative correspondent. It was interesting to me the number of people who could not pass an LC test that were graduates of major universities. I mean, it was surprising to me because it's a pretty easy exam, but the ability to write is a great skill to have in any kind of job. And it was. I would say over half the people could not pass the basic LC exam, and these were all college graduates, and often, not from the weak tier colleges either. From the top state schools, many of them. Most people couldn't pass that. It was amazing to me.
Well, what's interesting about that is going back to Dan Kennedy. He doesn't have a college education. He barely graduated high school. And a multimillionaire, and is known as the millionaire maker because, among other things, he's taught people that you don't need a college education to write. You need to understand persuasion and influence and marketing. So what you're saying just reinforces that.
Well, I would agree with you. I would agree with you on that. That the persuasion is much more important. And I'll give you an example. Often they would hire new people and they'd ask them if I have anything to do. And one of the things I've talked about is bounce back techniques. And one of the techniques we had was a signed book or booklet. It'd be 30 pages on the history of whatever that group was, or maybe the Constitution. Obviously, we wouldn't have to write the Constitution, but it'd be. I would have other people do that, and they all did very well, even though they didn't. But they were much worse at the marketing. As difficult as the writing is for some people, the marketing is much more difficult. They're even more lost when it comes to marketing than it does to writing.
And I can tell you, having been in marketing, for years and years, that I would agree, because as I work copy, almost without exception, everything that I study is mostly about marketing, and you use copy to get the marketing done. You and I once had a conversation about, for example, Ben Hart's book on direct mail. And I think you would agree that was mostly marketing with that wonderful, remember that wonderful checklist of 77 items that really is for copy.
Yeah, that's a great reference book. That's what I tell young copywriters to have that. You read all these books, but keep that chapter 7 there. If you need a house mailing idea or a prospect mailing idea, that's a reference book.
So what campaign to date, or maybe even since you're still working, would you say gave you the most satisfaction, and why was that? Was it more than just the success of the letter?
Well, actually, you have to go back to 1994. I headed up a political action committee because I'm actually not that into politics now, but back then I was, and we did a special expenditure against Speaker of the House Tom Foley, and people told me I was crazy, and we ran the first TV ad, and Of course, he lost, so it was that was like the start, around the start of my careers. But it was using the tools I learned through direct marketing, through working in campaigns. I left out. I managed a couple congressional campaigns, and what I also learned working at direct mail agencies. It was that was an interesting, just for one person to have that kind of, have an impact on a race, across the country was unusual. I didn't think people could do that. Now it's more common. Although I think the groups cancel each other out more. But at that time it was relatively rare for somebody to do that.
That's that's an interesting campaign. Tell me what's the for everybody who's listening, what's the real difference between political direct mail fundraising and charitable?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Well, Morris Dees, who's one of the counterparts to Richard Viguerie, Morris Dees was George McGovern's fundraiser in '72. He says that he's quoted in the New York Times in, I think, 1976 as saying that only people that are very conservative or very liberal give to political causes. The people in the middle, all they do is vote. So the first thing you want to do in a political mail is you want to preach to your base, and you don't want to equivocate, and you also want issues that cut, that are divisive. You don't want issues where everybody kind of agrees. Like I had a friend who he thought that fatherhood was extremely important, which everybody would agree with that, but that's what makes it a hard thing to raise money for. Now you might think this is obvious, but I remember this one girl doing a copy test, and she was extremely conservative, and I thought, well, she's very rigid in her beliefs. I thought, well, maybe she might be good a political copywriter. I knew she wouldn't be a good a charitable one, but her writing wasn't like that. Her writing was squishy, and it was kind of funny because she called me a rhino because I was against, I don't know, the Iraq War. This was around 10, 12 years ago. And I said, well, you write like a rhino. And she didn't like that. But it was true. Her writing was not like her temperament when I talked to her. So it's a fascinating thing. So you really want to be strong. You want issues that cut, like a guy you kind of remind me of is Craig Capp. I'll give you an example of what he did on the immigration issue. He'd have what appeared to be illegal aliens, burning the American flag, and some quote that somebody was really incendiary. He would so you're marrying a copy with a picture, and that's when I say issues that cut, issues that are divisive, where there's strong passion on one side or the other, or both sides. Those are the issues that work best in political direct mail. Charitable, you're often looking for a good story. I'm reminded of Covenant House, who has a story about the wayward girl who always had a coffee can everywhere she went, even when she was taking a shower. And it was the remains, you learn it was the remains of her mother. So stories, if you're somebody like Wendy Newman, which is one of my podcasts, she was great at storytelling. So she was a great charitable copywriter, but she wouldn't have been good at political copywriter. Wouldn't be. I actually think the storytelling is a little bit tougher of the two. That's my opinion, but it depends on what your skill set is.
Well, I agree, because we have become a visual. My opinion, we've become a visual culture, and so actually telling the story so that others can visualize it is a skill that takes quite a lot to do and a lot of study to be able to make it work. So
I agree.
I really understand, but since we're talking about that difference, what do you think are some of the most common mistakes that newer fundraising copywriters are making?
Well, when when a younger copywriter comes to me, they want to know how to do a better Pickett's charge. They don't want to know the overall strategy. They want to jump in without planning, and they don't know how to pass. In other words, they want to play every hand, kind of, if they were a poker player. They're just not patient, and they read one or two books and they think they're ready to go, and They may not be collaborative enough either. They don't. They'll seek people's help on their copy, but they won't ask for advice beforehand about whether that's a good letter or even a good client or a good issue, that kind of thing, which is the easiest thing to give advice on, because an older person would remember, oh, we've tried that before and it didn't work, that kind of thing. So you could at least say, well, look at the letter, see if you see some flaw in it. Just because something didn't work, it may have been 20 years ago, maybe it'll work now. But that kind of knowledge about what issues have worked in the past, what issues failed, is valuable. And a young person that doesn't study that or ask about that, I'll give another one. I remember a guy who failed. He had kind of a closed door policy. He'd go into work, close the door, and that's not the right approach. You really, when you're starting out, you need other people's help. You know what I mean? You need to be open. You really don't want your door closed both ways. Not just it was a metaphor for really what was his problem. Was he was closed down.
Yeah, well, with the copywriters, a lot of them are introverts. So, and then you've got the ego issue of, golly, I'm afraid to show somebody what I'm writing because I'm going to get red marked like crazy. And instead of looking at it as an opportunity, I see what you're saying. I know from listening to your podcasts that you're a huge proponent of studying and then restudying the masters. And the most recent one with Richard Viguerie proved the power of that method because he talked about doing it. So for somebody who's new, what 2 books would you really recommend for newer people to enter the field? What, to really kind of give them a baseline? What's your thoughts?
Well, I really like the Caples book. That one about headlines, you really need to study. And of course, I like the Claude Hopkins, both his books, Scientific Advertising and My Life in Advertising. I wouldn't have said that. I mean, there's other ones I like. I really like Gary Halbert. I think that's a fun book. But the one to study, I think that John Caples, that's definitely one you need to read. And I did a podcast on that, on him. I think it's definitely one that I would, particularly for emails. And interestingly enough, I think emails go more like the old kind of advertising. So it's not as far from being more modern. It's actually more retro. The subject lines is almost is very similar to a headline, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. No, I see that. And what's interesting is just like when advertising, was beginning to fatigue in some areas, it's the same with email. And people are putting lousy headlines and all the emails are getting deleted. So, that makes a lot of sense. I was looking, as I remember, you were only planning on doing 40 of these podcasts, but what have you done, 60?
66, I think, something like that. 67.
What'd you get out of podcasting?
Well, I mean, I got just rereading the Masters was huge. And like, for instance, like the David Ogilvy, which was one of the more popular episodes. I read both his books, and I watched his 2 YouTube videos. And you should go on YouTube and watch them too. So put around 6 hours into it, but it was well worth it. I mean, you just investing in your career is really well worth it. I got to meet people, reestablish relationships. One of the people passed away, Wendy Newman, and I played that. They asked me to speak at her funeral, and which was interesting because she's never a Facebook friend. That she got that, but I played that there, and they all found that her voice and everything. It was kind of a neat thing too. So it was a good experience.
Wait, obviously then it sounds like you'd recommend podcasting to others. What what methods do you recommend to get started?
Well, I think it is a good thing for people to do. It takes some discipline, though, and I have to say that some of my episodes weren't as good as the others. There's audio difficulties. I used the podcast Factory, Jonathan Rivera. I think you need something, unless you're really technical. A lot of younger people are. Me, not so much. But I think the key would be to have a number of episodes in the can before you started, because things will come up, if you're doing a weekly episode, and you want to be a few weeks ahead, because you don't want to be in the situation where, well, I don't have my guest canceled, I don't have anything to come up with, because that's when you're going to have your podcast is going to suffer, and then you don't want to turn people off and say, well, this isn't worth listening to. You can put up with one bad episode maybe, but and people have different tastes of what they like, but it takes some discipline, and I think that's a good thing, though, if you are able to do it.
Well, if you're especially if you're a writer, it's a disciplined thing. But I agree 100%. You've got to have some in the can, because everything goes wrong. Everything from, when I used to travel extensively, I would let the people know that I'm getting ready to come and give a presentation I use this very, very simple phrase, and that is, I still have my appendix. And they would say, well, what does that mean? And the answer is, if I don't show up, there's a chance I had to have it taken out. So be ready with a backup plan. So, I really understand that. And I'm watching the clock here, and we're starting to get towards the end. But, there's one thing that I've noticed as a recurring theme, and I've always wanted to ask, and that is, you're always referring to the results of split testing. And it's always great information, because it's not something I see in other media or other places that I go to study or to listen. So what's a good source to stay on top of testing, so you know what's working and what isn't working?
Well, I'd love to know. I go to these DMAWs, the Direct Marketing Association of Washington, and people will share their results. But in general, they don't. And results vary over time. So I would love to know all the results, but those are kind of like almost privileged information. The people sometimes will share those results with you, but I don't know of any books that would be a great book where they just showed test results.
Well, like I say, I hear you doing it all the time, and it's just amazing to me. And it's part of it, I'm sure, is the fact of you doing the podcasting and constantly speaking with the senior people. And I don't mean by age; I'm talking about of experience and picking up niblets here and there. But you have an incredibly active mind, and I thought, well, maybe you've got a source, so I had to ask.
Oh yeah, well, a lot of them were my own tests. Yeah, there were, and other people have told me test results too. I don't necessarily trust as much, because sometimes things can vary, and just statistically. So I don't know if they're statistically valid when they tell me that. But you definitely need to test. Some things are hard to test, though. For example, if you're with like a museum and you can't, to be a member, it's hard to have two different prices to be a member. So, you don't know if 35 or 50 or 60 or whatever the optimal number is. So that's always going to be a little bit of a mystery. I found that, I like testing. I found that some people are a little too rigid. They want to know, they want things to be black or white. They don't like ambiguity. And I really think you need to, although I certainly, I understand that. I would like the world to be that way more too, but you have to kind of embrace the ambiguity sometimes. That, just play the odds. It's more likely to be this way than that way. But I could be wrong. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. And part of what you're saying is we're dealing with people. And, it's really funny, because I've always said, the church would be a much better place if it weren't for the people. Because,
yeah, exactly.
Because the people are the ones with the failings, and and everyone is different. And I think from a marketing and persuasion and influence point of view, we rely on the principle that all people react in predictable ways. But we can't necessarily always predict the way they're going to act. So I have one other last question I wanted to ask, and that is, I know that as you go through each of the podcasts, you kind of allude to this, but what are 3 questions that you should ask in every fundraising appeal? I realize that's a real specific question, but I've sensed through each of the podcasts, which I encourage everybody to go back and listen to, that there are 3 questions that really should be, asked.
Well, I was talking to my business partner, Mark Mehling, the other day about this because we've formed an agency, and although we're doing the writing right now, we will be using other people. And it's always a difficult thing. Do you just let anything go out? Well, I mean, because you're endorsing it. But you don't want to rein in the horse too much either. So this is what he said, that every mailing you should ask these questions. And the first is there engagement or attention? And that could be an involvement device, but doesn't have to be. But there has to be an engagement. Maybe it's something in the news or something to get your attention. But that's the first thing. The second thing was urgency. The third was a motivation to make a gift. And I thought 2 and 3 were similar, but I came across, but they are, and they do overlap a little bit, but I came across a letter that kind of does this well, and it's from Morris Dees, who I mentioned earlier, Southern Poverty Law Center, and it says in red in a stamp that looks like it's stamped on, deadline for doubling the impact of your gift, December 31st. I'll just read the first paragraph or 2. Dear James Newberry, we're less than a year into the Trump presidency, but one thing is crystal clear. We're in a fight for the very soul of our country. Mr. Trump has energized white supremacists in unprecedented ways and reversed hard, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so he has urgency, but, the stuff against Trump, the far right and all that kind of stuff. But then he also has a motivation to give a gift. You double your impact of your gift, a matching gift through December 31st. See what I'm saying? So he says that Stuart says all letters should have those 3. And then I asked him, I said, well, surely there's some other things that are important too. And these are not as important, but I would also say these are important. One was credibility. And you might do credibility through testimonials, newspaper articles, things of that sort. Credibility ranges in importance. So if you're the Salvation Army, you already have a lot of credibility. Probably not as important. A group not known, very important. It's more important. Still, credibility doesn't break into the top 3 because people can think that you're credible and still not give to you unless you need. For example, the Red Cross is going to get a lot of donations, and when you had the Puerto Rico. But they're not going to. People are much less likely to give to them ordinarily. And I came up with one. And it's from the verisimilitude. That's from who was that guy? I can't think of his name. Three name guy. And that is authenticity. And a lot of times a letter has. Herschel Gordon Lewis is who I was looking for. Okay, I went to his seminar, and I went to his seminar, and that was really transformational. He talks about how you kind of give away. I'll give you an example. You have what looks like personal correspondence, maybe a wedding invitation, something like that, a thank you note, and then you use all sorts of teaser copy. Well, if it's really personal, you wouldn't be doing teaser. You know what I'm saying? Or another example is you have a blue signature, in thick felt, and then you use side margin notes, which Herschel liked, by the way, but they're in like black and a different font. You know what I mean? And a different, so it's supposed to be. Well, that's the same person who's signing the letter, writing those notes. I mean, you give away. So that's not as important, but certainly try to match that up. Try to make it seem like it's logically that person could. I think people realize that the person's not necessarily signing this. I mean, but as much as possible, you want to create the illusion that this is a personal letter. This is one-on-one communication. So I put that in there. It's not as important as the top 3, but I like all 5. Just like a basketball team, you might have 3 stars or so, but you gotta fill out the team.
Well, that last point that you're talking about, consistency, is, to me, is instantly one of the giveaways. I collect almost every package that arrives in my mailbox for my personal go-to file, and I analyze each one to say, all right, if I were involved, would I do anything different? What do I like about it? What I don't? And consistency is one of the first things that instantly stands out. As you point out, most people aren't stupid when something comes in the mail. They know in their heart that this is probably a solicitation. So why ruin it with exactly the points you're talking about?
Well, I'll give you a test result since you're interested. This is a head-to-head test. And they took it was a personal font created by the writer, the actual writer. We did every letter. It cost a couple $1,000s to do this. And it beat what I thought was a good computer font. I mean, there's some bad computer fonts. This is a good handwritten. And it beat it more than people were really surprised by how much it beat it. So there it goes. It just was so much more authentic, So it really, I could give you other test results too, but that one, think about the authenticity of it. Now, some people I know that have been successful and they do things that are, like the personal letter that I'm talking about with a window. I don't get that. It's not logical to me. But, you can still make it work without it, but that doesn't mean it's the best. You know what I'm saying?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I will tell you that something that's changed in the past few years, because I just used it, and that is now you can actually get your own font for like $10 or $20.
That low? Yeah. Well, that's what I was talking about. Yeah, we have clients do that. I didn't know it was so cheap that it used to be more expensive.
Oh, it used to be outrageous. Absolutely. I have a campaign that's out right now, and it starts out. It's from a pastor, and it's going to people who are not members of his church, but that have been supporters. And it starts out by saying, I'm an Arkansas boy, and if I sent this in my own handwriting, it would be unreadable. So please excuse the fact that it's typed. And but the follow-on, the thank you, is going to be done in his handwriting, as it were, because it's a font that mirrors exactly what he does. And it's phenomenal because this is a kind of guy, he's a younger guy. And, most people don't do cursive anymore. So it's perfect use of the font, and it's going to be for the thank you notes, for the personal thank you notes.
Well, it's interesting. The first letter I ever did was handwritten P.S. That the candidate did for all his family and friends. So it definitely works. It makes it look more personal. That if a different font, a different color, maybe. I like that.
Oh yeah, and I've got 2 campaigns out. This one that we're talking about is going to a very small list, but we had him handwrite the PS because it's only 50 of them. And the PS referenced an enclosure that he put in there. It's a bookmark. So it's using 4 or 5 different tools at the same time. And so far, we're getting, we'll wait to see what it shows up, but we're looking like an average over $125 a donor. And last year, a similar letter I did had 100% response. So we're kind of hoping it's going to work out the same way. But
impressive.
And on a small list, I credit the list more than my copy. We all know that a good list can overcome poor copy, but great copy can't overcome a bad list. So
your lists are extremely important. It goes back, to Richard Viguerie. How did he get his start? The Goldwater, going back to that, it was a defeat, yet 2 things came out of it. You had Ronald Reagan gave his famous speech, and he ultimately became president, but that was the major thing. But don't discount what Richard Viguerie did by getting those names of people and communicating to them. Before there was Fox or talk radio, conservative direct mail was the only way that conservative Republicans could connect, and it did play an important role. He is not exaggerating that at all. And and still plays an important role. Probably not as much as talk radio or Fox News now, but from that 65 period, early 60s to, I don't know, Rush came on, I think around late 80s, if I recall. From that period, it was the dominant advertising vehicle.
Yeah, I agree. I think lists are probably one of the most underutilized, in the sense of people don't research up enough, they don't split them enough, they don't segment their lists enough, they don't change the letters to make sure they're targeting their ideal clients, and it all comes down to lists. And the side note of that, for anyone who's new in this area, is that includes your own personal house file list when you're going after clients. So,
you've probably read Eugene Schwartz, so you could have definitely done a podcast with him too. I like his quote about in the world of beauty, ugly stands out, or something like that. But the reason he did work for Boardroom and all these other groups was to get their list. That was the trade-off. So that gives you an idea. He wouldn't have been able to market his products, because those lists, there's only so many lists out there. It's key. I probably didn't put enough attention to it, and you're correct. Most others don't either. But without the list, you could have a great product, but if there's not the list out there, and you don't have access to them, you're dead in the water.
Well, and I think I have personal examples. I did some pro bono work for a nonprofit on their list, and it turned out it was a bad list. And they were, they're asking families with 5 and 8 kids to make a large donation, and nothing was there. And when I had outlined, this is what I need for you to separate out, they didn't do it. And so it did all right. I wouldn't say it failed. They made money, but it just didn't do nearly what it could have with a little bit of list work.
A little tweaking, yeah. So, I agree. Well, listen, Mark, I really enjoyed talking to you. I'm glad you've gone into it. Let me ask you, what are your favorite podcasts that you listen to? What episodes did you like?
I have to tell you, I'm one of those people that just listens to everyone. It's
okay.
I love listening.
Well, there are some that are a lot better than others.
Well, you keep referring back to that, but in actuality, my view is every podcast is not some shining piece of gold for me to grab. It's like mining in everything, because some of it I'm not going to understand and will miss something, but there's always a golden nugget somewhere in there. And just listening to the Richard Armstrongs, the Richard Vigories, all your guests has really been absolutely amazing. And I have to tell you, James, it's been an honor to be part of your Encore final broadcast. And I really think I speak for everyone in saying thank you for the effort, for the information, and really for the motivation. So what are your plans going forward?
Well, I've started a new agency with my friend Stuart, so we're going to be concentrating there. We have signed about a half dozen clients, so got a busy 2018 coming up, and so I'll be spending time there. I'm going to still try to I'm not going to do 2 hours a day like Richard Vigory, but I'm going to try to do 2 hours a week. And I would encourage everybody, if 2 hours a week's too much, at least do a half hour, an hour, whether that's reading samples or the masters or whatever, podcasts, I would encourage everybody to do that. This is New Year's coming.
Thanks for everything, James, and this is your show, so I'm going to let you close it out.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Hey, I've enjoyed it. I want to thank all the guests that appeared on the show, and people like my son and Stuart I kind of came at the last second sometimes. I was running out of time. Thank you for your patience. And till next time, bye.